Reclaiming Democracy show. My name is Jackie Brown Miller, and today our guest is Carl J. Mayer, an attorney from New York City and New Jersey area. Carl has been an activist and scholar in the area of fighting corporate power for 20 years, and he's going to have a little conversation with us today about his work and about some of the issues he's been fighting that are related to corporate power. Welcome, Carl.
Thanks, Jackie. Thank you. Thank you very much for having me. It's great to be here. Thanks to the Alliance for Democracy for having me. They're bringing me tonight to the Traditions Cafe here. And thanks to the Unitarian Church. And I'm thrilled to be here in the Pacific Northwest, the home of the pioneers. Actually, part of what I'm talking about today, we need some pioneering. We need people who will pioneer in the area of restoring our democracy and taking it away from the corporate interests and the lobbyists that govern it. So that's why I came, and it's great to be here.
Well, we're sure glad to have you. So the New York Times called you a populist, crusader, and a maverick lawyer. And I think they were talking about your work with a New York Attorney General Elliot Spitzer when they said that.
Right.
Do you want to maybe tell me a little bit about what your work was there?
Well, in part they were discussing that. Fortunately, Elliot, I've known, I guess, since college, he has been one of the more activist attorney generals in the country. Mm-hmm. And we really need public servants who are willing to step forward and challenge the injustice and the overreaching of corporate power in the country, because there aren't enough to do that. Although I do understand you've had a very activist Attorney General here in Washington, and actually I think in coordination with Elliot, you're starting to see more Attorney Generals around the state assert the power of the states to protect the environment, to provide proper wages for employees when they're cheated out of their wages. So what I did at Elliot's office, New York State Attorney General, a number of things. First thing that I did was I was one of the lawyers heading up the litigation against the gun companies. The gun companies in this country, they don't do a couple things. First thing they don't do is they don't provide child safety locks on the guns. All right? So we sued them in New York State Court on several grounds. Basically, one of them was negligence in providing guns to the population that don't have child safety locks. It's like your car has a child safety lock on the windows.
Right.
Every year, there are hundreds of American children die because they accidentally pick up their parents' gun. There's no lock on it, and there's no regulation of safety regulation of guns. Right? If you buy a teddy bear in a store, there are all sorts of regulations that the FTC puts on it, right? It's got to be labeled, it has to be, a flame retardant, you can't burst into flames, but buy a gun, no regulations. So we went to court, we wound up, in that litigation, we wound up settling with a number of the major gun manufacturers. They realized that they didn't have the better of the argument. They did the right thing. Smith & Wesson, when they started putting gun locks on guns. The other aspect of the litigation, though, what we were trying to accomplish was to get these gun companies to stop selling to certain dealers who are known to sell to criminals. Because there's only a limited number of dealerships, gun dealerships in the country that sell directly to the criminals. So we never got into the issue, the NRA issue, should you have the gun control, but we just got into the safety issues. And I thought we achieved something valuable in the litigation. The other thing I did was an investigation of nursing homes. A lot of nursing homes are violating laws in this country because they don't provide adequately for their senior residents. We found, for example, we do studies of nursing homes, and a lot of the residents of the nursing homes, they were dying from fourth-degree bed sores, malnourishment, all sorts of diseases that could only be caused by neglect. So we launched an effort to crack down on those issues. So the point is that you need more public officials to confront corporate power rather than just acquiesce to it. And the reason that so many state officials are doing it now are that primarily that in Washington, corporate
DC.
lobbyists in Washington, D.C., I'm sorry, not Washington State. In Washington, D.C., corporate lobbyists run the show, and so it's devolved to the states to be at the forefront of democracy, which is not a bad thing. The ironic thing, though, is that the Republican Party, which considers themselves states' righters, all of a sudden they're saying, whoa, states' rights doesn't mean that we should have attorney generals actually protect the public, protect the environment, protect consumers, protect workers.
Right.
Oh, that's going too far. Well, that's a hypocritical component of their ideology.
Yeah. One of the other things that you're very noteworthy for is that in 1990 you wrote a law review article that I've read. I think it's excellent. And
Thank you. Thanks for the readership. Unfortunately, you don't get royalties on law review articles.
Right. Well, it was published in Hastings Law Journal,
right.
And it basically went through 3 different eras of regulation in this country. I think it was the modern, the New Deal era, or wait a minute, well, it ended with the modern era, and then it went back to
the New Deal and the Progressive era.
Progressive was the one
That's
before
right.
that. And you basically tracked how corporations have been going to the United States Supreme Court and asking for varying degrees of constitutional rights depending on which era they were in. And as we get into the modern era, my recollection of your paper is that because the modern era regulations, the environmental laws, the OSHA type laws, really have an impact on the corporate bottom line.
Right.
They started looking for more intangible rights within the Bill of Rights and more intangible types of property.
That's right.
So I'm glad that you're here because it seems like you're a real expert on corporate personhood, aka corporate civil rights, and the Supreme Court's treatment of that issue. And indeed, in your paper, you tracked how the Supreme Court has analyzed it under the artificial entity theory here and the natural person theory here, and they're sort of schizophrenic, and in the modern era they've changed to actually look at, instead of artificial versus natural entity, they've looked at will the purpose of the amendment be served, and how that really isn't even consistent how in their treatment.
Right.
So well, what do you think about how this issue of corporate personhood is affecting our ability as citizens to really participate in our democratic system and to have a say over things like whether we go to war, whether our water is privatized, whether Walmart comes to town, and those sorts of things, whether we can have local living economies. I know those are big issues to bite off, but if you just wanted to pick one and talk about it.
That's fine. First of all, I must say I'm very impressed, as you evidently read the article with great care. So I appreciate your very succinct summary of the article. But what essentially the importance of this is that the Constitution was crafted by the framers, the founders of the nation, the framers of our republic. The Constitution was crafted to protect us as individuals. It begins with the preamble, we the people, and then it goes on to enumerate the purposes of the Constitution to provide for justice, to promote the general welfare, etc. Nowhere in that document is there a mention of corporations. Even though the people who founded the Republic, they knew about corporations. Corporations existed at the time, but they chose not to put it into the language of the document. So what I want people to understand, and I think progressives of all varieties, what they don't understand sufficiently is that this is enormous judicial activism, right? The right wing and the Republicans are always screaming that this court is too activist, or that court is too activist. They're not obeying the language of the document, right? Well, this is the greatest judicial activism in the history of the Republic, in my mind, is creating rights for corporations that are equivalent to our rights.
Right.
And what's happened ever since is that corporations they've jammed up our court system by asserting all sorts of constitutional rights every time government wants to take any action to protect the people. So, for example, a case I was involved in, there's a case involving the Nike shoe company. Went all the way to the Supreme Court. The issue there is Nike has these factories in Asia. They don't observe even the local laws regarding working conditions. They're underage women and children working in those factories. They're working there 16, 20 hours a day, 7 days a week, unsanitary conditions, dormitories. They get paid less than 20 cents an hour. Okay? Doesn't even comply with the local.
Just checking, make sure you weren't wearing Nike shoes.
No, I'm not wearing Nike shoes. No, I gave up. I wear New Balance. They're American made. Sometimes I wear Reeboks when I can't find them. But no, I gave up wearing Nike many years ago. And I used to be a runner. No. But the issue is a very serious one, because you got sweatshop labor. These products are imported here. And the issue in the case was that there's a California law that requires that these conditions be disclosed to workers, to consumers. Excuse me. This is truth in advertising. If they're using sweatshop labor to make their shoes, they have to tell the citizens. Well, they weren't doing it. In fact, they were doing the opposite of it. They were writing letters to newspapers. They were writing letters to their customers, including the big universities, saying, whoa, we make our sneakers in terrific conditions. We comply with all the laws. We don't use sweatshop labor. Total fabrication. So they went all the way up to the Supreme Court saying, we have a constitutional right, a First Amendment right as Nike Corporation, to lie about the conditions in our factories. And we were saying, no, the right of the people to regulate your speech and have truth in advertising and truth about what your product is all about, that trumps any right that you would assert.
And that sort of gets in, isn't part of that also the distinction? They make this distinction between commercial speech and political free speech.
Yeah.
And political free speech under the Constitution can only be impinged upon by the government, such as the Truth in Advertising Law or something like that, if, under a strict scrutiny test. So the government has to have a compelling state interest and its law has to be narrowly tailored to achieve that interest. But with commercial speech, they can, my understanding is that it's a little easier for the government to impinge upon commercial speech, such as to say your speech has to be truthful.
That's right.
Wasn't part of the case too where Nike was saying, we're not really engaging in commercial speech, we're really engaging in political speech?
Mm-hmm. That's exactly right, and that's why you're a good lawyer. You had a succinct summary. You had a succinct summary of the law in the area. Basically, the reason the distinction arose is because the framers of the Constitution wanted to protect the core rights of human beings arising out of what happened during the Revolutionary period. During the Revolutionary period, a lot of Americans were thrown in jail, executed, tortured before the Revolution just for what they said. And what they were talking about was important political ideas. Important political ideas like, we don't want to live under a monarch, we don't want to live under the tyranny of George III, we want a democracy. And they could be executed for that.
Right.
So that's why the Supreme Court came to recognize that there are two different types of speech. That kind of core political speech, where you're talking about the important issues of the day, you can say basically whatever you want. Right? If I wanted to say, to hell with corporate America, right here in Olympia, Washington, I can do it. And the Constitution protects my right to do it, which is a beautiful thing, because not that many countries have it. Now, on the other hand, the other type of speech is what they consider commercial speech, and that's advertising. I'm selling toothpaste, I'm selling mayonnaise, whatever I say about those products, that's entitled to less protection. And that's a good thing, too, because you don't want deception in the marketplace. You need truth in advertising. And that's what the Nike case was all about. And the problem is that these corporations keep going into court and gumming up the legal system, even though they're the ones trying to deny individuals the right to get into court, right? It's not good when individuals go to court to fight for their rights. But when corporations are fighting for their rights, they're in there 24/7. So they go to court And they are trying to maintain that every time they talk about sneakers or toothpaste or mayonnaise or whatever product it is, that somehow that's political speech.
Right.
And we don't believe, no one believes it.
It's bunk.
It is bunk. That's exactly right. It is bunk. And I'm going to quote you on that. It is absolute bunk. And yet they keep making this argument. They keep trying to say, these corporations keep trying to say that every time they open their mouths to deceive the public about what they're doing, about putting dangerous additives into the food, about using sweatshop labor, about destroying the environment, every time they put out propaganda saying they're not doing that to make a buck, that somehow it's protected because it's a political statement. It's nonsense. It's not a political statement. You know, if a corporation wants to make a statement about the war in Iraq that has nothing to do with its profits, you know, then let them do it. Maybe that's political. But when they're talking about their product, that's commercial speech, and that entitles the government to regulate it, to protect the people. Because the market can't function unless you have free information. And one of the points I'm going to be making in my speech tonight, actually, is that these corporations are the greatest threat to the free market in the history of America. And too often, progressive people think they don't make that argument.
Right.
They think they leave the free market argument to the Republicans and the corporations. And what's really going on is that rather than having free markets in this country, we have corporate managed markets, corporate manipulated markets, often through the political processes. So that's part of what I'll be talking about too.
So is that simply because they get a lot of governmental subsidies, or are there other ways in which they manipulate the free market as well?
Well, there are numerous ways that they do it, but the biggest way is they go to Washington or they go to the state capitals and they lobby for the subsidies. These are the biggest, fattest corporate welfare kings in the history of the country. And we just saw, for example, last month, Congressman from California, Duke Cunningham, pled guilty to taking millions of dollars of bribes from defense contractors, and in return, he was giving those contractors government contracts worth multi-millions of dollars. And that is the way that corporations manipulate the market. Rather than compete on the basis of who's making the best product, doesn't matter whether it's a missile, a bomb, or a pair of shoes, they go to the government and they try to do the deal by bribing, sometimes legally and sometimes illegally, as in the case of Duke Cunningham, the politicians. In Cunningham's case, one defense contractor pled guilty to taking $1 million in bribes. In return, he got $150 million in defense contracts. So you see where the taxpayer dollar is going. And people in this country say, why aren't my taxes going up? Why can't I make ends meet? Well, the reason is that the burden of taxation that corporations pay has dropped from 30% of the total tax pie back in the 1970s down to 6%. And who makes up the difference? That's right. You do, I do.
You know,
all the people listening do. All the taxpayers do.
I was having this conversation with my sister yesterday, who likes to complain a lot about her taxes, and she said she just switched jobs and had this big amount of vacation, and she cashed it out. And she said, you know, and she lives in the Midwest, in a state where they have income tax. So for her, it's probably a little worse than it would be for me living in Washington in a state that doesn't have income tax. But nonetheless, she said, you know, that refund was $3,000, and you know the government took a third of it, and I'm mad. I'm disgusted. I could just spit. And I wanted to tell her something along the lines of what you just said. But she's so enculturated in the whole corporate, sort of, the media that doesn't really portray the things that corporations are doing and how sort of unfair the system is toward the wealthy elite who own the corporations and are not wage earners, but are rather just gaining wealth through dividends, and they increase those by engaging in the use of money as speech with the politicians to get elected to make it so their corporations are more profitable, including a lessening of their tax burden. And I don't know, I mean, how do you deal with that issue? That people just don't get it. I mean, they're really being, I guess you could say, screwed over by corporate America using their money to get tax breaks that are so unfair, but they just don't see it.
Well, corporations don't want you to give it, and they spend millions, hundreds of millions every year on image advertising, on these slick ads for politicians from both parties. They don't want you to get it. Americans, I believe, are increasingly getting it. For example, there was a Harris Interactive survey that came out in January. It's a polling, and the question on the table was, do you believe that big business has too much power in Washington, D.C., not Washington State? Answer, 90% answered yes. The highest ever for that survey, which has been going on for over 25 years. Okay? So Americans are beginning to get it at a gut level, that they're being taken to the cleaners by corporate lobbyists who have stolen their democracy. But they need to do more than understand, and I hope they'll begin to fight it. And you can fight it, and you can win, and people have fought it and won in different eras of American history, in the Progressive era, in the New Deal era, in the 19th century. When people band together and fight concentrated power, they can win, but they have to want to do it first. And if anyone doubts what I'm talking about on these tax issues, I know, for example, you're saying your sister doubts it because she's just accustomed to what she reads. And usually she reads a lot of propaganda from the corporations who will say, oh, those bureaucrats are just wasting your tax dollars.
Exactly.
Well, those bureaucrats are usually wasting tax dollars, or legislators are wasting tax dollars on corporations who are getting the subsidies. So if anyone doubts what I'm saying, they're terrific exposés on almost all these issues. But a book by David K. Johnson, who's a reporter for the New York Times, is a Pulitzer Prize-winning book, won the prize for Best Investigative Book of the Year. I believe the title is Legalized Bribery, but it's all about it's David K. Johnson. Just Google David K. Johnson, and you will arrive at the title of the book. New York Times bestseller. It details how the tax system operates in this country, and it is stunning. Everyone watching this program should read that book and reflect on it. And if they don't get sufficiently indignant reading that book to take a weekend or two or three of their time and do something about the tax issue, then they haven't read the book thoroughly. Because what it does, in page after page, it shows how for the last 30 years, the taxes have been ratcheted up on the middle class and the poor, while the tax burden has been reduced on the wealthiest people in this country. For example, it's now the case that in terms of income, the wealth disparity is so great that the top earning 13,400 families in this country earn as much as the 96 million Americans at the bottom of the income scale. Okay, 13,400 families on the one hand, 96 million on the other hand. So the graphic representation of this is if you filled a third of Yankee Stadium with the 13,400 people, they have as much income as everyone who lives in this country west of Iowa, including the people in Iowa.
Oh my God.
Okay? That's the income disparity that this tax system has generated. And there are example after example in this book. For example, the chairman of Coke, a guy named Guzietta, at one point in the 1990s, he was earning $100 million a year. Guess what his tax rate? $100 million a year was his compensation. $100 million per year. What was his tax rate on that?
25%?
2%.
Wow.
2%.
A personal income tax.
Correct. 2% because he used a series of tax loopholes that were passed mostly in the 1980s, some in the 90s. What they did was they allowed them to incorporate offshore, set up offshore trusts, use life insurance policies to put them in other trust vehicles that skip the estate tax altogether. And there is no end to the number of loopholes these corporations put in the tax code. The tax code of the United States, it goes taller than this, from the floor up to there, and there are lobbyists and lawyers who spend full time working the loopholes for very wealthy individuals and for corporations. And you need a total reform of that system.
So it sounds like we not to interrupt you, but it sounds like we need a total reform
interrupt
of a
me
lot
anytime.
of. Okay. Okay. It sounds like we need a total reform of a number of systems. Our tax system. You know, I heard you talking the other day that, you know, you were wondering how could it be that we have these terrific exposés on things like the book Eric Schlosser did called Fast Food Nation,
Yeah.
and other such books, and the fact that, you know, even some corporate media now are starting to say that the American public was hoodwinked over this war in Iraq, and it was basically built on a bunch of lies, in essence, so that we could get over there and get oil. I mean, they're practically saying that on our mainstream corporate media channels now, and yet there's never any reform. And I have a theory that that's because the corporate interests that we're talking about have consolidated their power so much that they've taken over the very mechanisms that we as citizens would need to use to get this reform.
Yeah.
And that would include the media and all different levels of government, maybe not city council, but certainly maybe in the bigger cities it would include city council, but definitely our federal and state legislatures. And so how do we start? It's like a chicken and egg problem.
Right.
What are your recommendations on how we get pieces of our democratic mechanisms back? How do we get control of those so that we can start to get these reforms?
Right. Well, first of all, if I have a little message to progressives, and there are a lot of progressives in the Olympia area and Washington State in general, which is one of the wonderful things about coming out here and being on the show, being on a community show. This is the type of wide-ranging discussion that you don't get it on the soundbite, you know, Fox News type of thing, right? It's a lot of snarling.
Mm-hmm.
This is a serious discussion, and this is important. So my message is, too often progressives think that it's hopeless, and my message is they should not, because in other periods of American history, the citizens have risen up and resisted corporate power, they've resisted wrong-headed wars like the Vietnam War, which is citizen stopped, citizen opposed, and citizen stopped. Had nothing to do with the elected leaders or the corporations. It came from the citizens in the street. And secondly, in the New Deal period, they stood up to the predators on Wall Street who had been fleecing the public, damaged the economy. So, as the British historian Carlyle observed, no lie can live forever. And the lies that are increasingly told by corporate interests or their hired political hands, I think, are being understood by the American people. And speaking of the war, there's a terrific book that just came out. It's called American Theocracy, and it's by Kevin Phillips, who's a Republican. Not only is he a Republican, he's a Nixon Republican. So, and he, yeah. Ooh. But in his book, he, chapter and verse, recites how this war in Iraq, which is wrong-headed, was done for oil and not for any purposes related to the attacks on this country. He has a terrific chapter, for example, on the initial invasion of Baghdad, how the troops were, there was much made of the fact that troops were never sent to the museum in downtown Baghdad to protect the antiquities that are in downtown Baghdad, but they went right to the Ministry of Oil, surrounded the Ministry of Oil, surrounded the oil fields. That was their initial purpose. My point in this is, when Noam Chomsky and Kevin Phillips agree on something, it's time to perk up and take notice. So a lot of our foreign policy is driven by corporations, all these trade deals that ship American jobs overseas while importing goods that are produced by brutalized child labor and underpaid labor. All these trade deals are done at the behest of corporate interests. And so you ask, what can you do? In Washington State, you have a lot of tools you don't have in other states.
Like what?
Well, you've got initiative and referendum. You could put on the ballot. And I don't know whether you've done this. I don't know whether it's been done in Washington. Maybe you can tell me. Why not put an initiative on expressing dissatisfaction, expressing citizen opposition to the war in Iraq? You could do that.
That's
There are
a
even
great idea.
there are even propositions. There are even propositions at a local level. You have proposition power at a local level. Why could not the citizens of Olympia go out, put a proposition on the ballot that is the sentiment of the citizens of Olympia, Washington, that the United States withdraw its troops and refocus its army on fighting terrorism, not on working for the oil companies. So you have great tools here. Gosh, I only wish we had these tools back in New Jersey, where I'm from,
Along
or
with
even
the
New York.
fresh air.
Right, that's along with the fresh air. Yeah, I wish we could export all the fresh air and the Douglas firs and the cedars, and and some of your political tools. So there's nothing stopping the citizens right here, right now, from going and doing something like that. There are a few locales around the country that have started to do this, but it would be terrific if a real movement started out here.
Mm-hmm. Alliance for Democracy could lead it.
Alliance for Democracy could lead it. You're leading a lot of things, but that would be an important thing. There's Walmart, for example. I don't know if there've been any resolutions, any propositions opposing what Walmart is doing in this, all over the country, or any initiative or referendum, but there's nothing stopping the citizens from doing it.
Right.
Other than it takes time, and you have to understand it's long odds, and you're fighting an uphill battle. But in life, anything that's worth having is hard getting, and it's particularly true of important issues. So, you know, I think the citizens are starting to get it, and I think they'll do something about it.
Well, thank you, Carl. It's been a
Thank
pleasure
you.
having you on our show.
Thank you. Really appreciate it. It's great being here.
This has been the Reclaiming Democracy Show. Thank you for tuning in.